This is the Westminster Standard Podcast. Welcome. I'm Ryan Biese, and today I'm joined by Thomas Rickard, Professor Ben Dunson, and teaching elder Zach Garris. Thomas, you're the clerk in Westminster Presbytery. Is that still the case?
Yes, they haven't taken me out yet, but
Okay.
it's one of those jobs I think that no one else wants. So
come and take it, please. And Professor Dunson, you are a faculty member at Greenville Seminary, professor of New Testament there.
That's right. Yep. Yeah, and TE as well.
And the teaching elder, yes. And
Yep.
Teaching elder Zach Garris, you are representing Rio Grande Presbytery.
That's right. Yeah, I'm out in New Mexico.
Yes. Well, today will be somewhat different in that I think all three of my guests disagree with me on my position. And so I look forward to being educated and being told why I am wrong. Teaching elder Rickard, you recently published an article of brotherly appeal to abstain or refrain from using the title Deaconesses. So I'm looking forward to that dialogue with you. It was a very respectful article. But Professor Dunson, perhaps you would walk us through where the office of deacon originates.
Yeah, I mean, you've got the specific word, and you've just brought it up, diakonos in Greek, which is a word that at its most basic just means servant. That's actually, and we can come back to that, but that's the source of some of the confusion, is that the word means servant. It can apply to any number of people engaged in acts of service, but the Apostle Paul uses it in a restricted sense in 1 Timothy chapter 3, where he's talking about a specific called office after he's just mentioned the elders and their office, and so I mean that's the basic New Testament background for that. I mean, in a really condensed fashion. You've got in Acts chapter 6, you've got people who are engaged in service, men who are chosen for service, and often that will be appealed to as well, as far as a specific service in the church that allows other men to focus on preaching the gospel and administering the sacraments and so on.
And you, at least I find it interesting that in Acts 6, I think the word deacon or servant doesn't appear in its nominal form, but the verbal form is there. So that sometimes leads to some confusion.
Right. A lot of times it's more like, I think it's more just the idea there of deacons rather than looking for a specific word. But I mean, that's the thing about the word, is it's not actually a technical term in the first century. It's a word that can be used, applied to anyone who's doing any sort of service in any way, in a generic sense. It's just
such as Nero.
Right. I mean, yeah. I mean, the governing authorities being called servants. That's right. And no one suggests that they're an officer in the church. That Nero was a special instance of the office of deacon.
Yes. So now, where did this idea of deaconess originate? There's, of course, a translation of Romans 16:1 where that could be rendered. Thomas, do you want to help us understand when and how this deaconess idea came into the Reformed Church?
yeah, so I think it's always kind of been present, particularly in the West. There's been, particularly I think Nicaea, one of their canons. So they just don't write a creed; they write canons, and I think it's in the 19th one. They speak of deaconesses, but they're distinguished that as an office. It's not an office, but so it's there. I think it's inconclusive. I think it's sporadic, specifically in the Western Church, and so it kind of gets replaced with nuns. And so that's kind of where it gets replaced with in medieval, and then in the Reformed Church, you speak of Reformed Church as very broad, Calvin, they often will point to Calvin and say that Calvin had deaconesses. And I think that I'm not sure that we would say that that's accurate. To my knowledge, again, Calvin wrote a lot. My knowledge is he never used that term to describe people. He really likes the terminology of widow in 1 Timothy chapter 5. He really likes that. That's what he actually calls Phoebe in his commentary on Romans. So, we kind of have that term. He explains that there's the office, and then there's these other aspects. So it's always been there in the background, and depending on the denomination, it really varies. But Reformed practice, it really creeps in the 19th century, towards the end of the 19th century, 1886 or thereabouts. The RPs, they adopt the terminology of deaconess around that time. And so you kind of see it creep in a lot more in that period of time. But it's always been in the background. I think that it depends on which branch you look at, where that is. In the PCUS, it's never been an aspect of it. But that's kind of just a broad overview of where it comes from, and the history of it.
So, Zach, you've written a lot on the role of women in the church and the role of men in the church. As I see the Greek up there, diakonon, would you walk us through why did it take so long for the idea of deaconesses to become prominent in the Reformed Church? It looks like that just transliterating the Greek there, it looks like deaconess. How come it took so long? Why is this such or on the other hand, why is this so novel? The position that the deaconess is drawn from Scripture.
Well, I think it's the simple fact that there's not really an explicit basis for an office of deaconess in the New Testament. So, that language, if we're just referring to women as servants using, the word deaconess, that's not really that big a deal. But it's understanding as an office. So the consensus Reform view, I think, is the proper term for is that Acts 6 speaks of the establishment of the diaconate, and you have 7 men appointed there. So some of this was already referenced. And then you have 1 Timothy 3, which is talking about men, male elders, and then male deacons. I realize verse 11 there is debated, and we can mention that. And then the passage you have up, Romans 16:1 with Phoebe, and it's even not entirely clear that's a title. It's some sort of reference, obviously, to her as a servant of the church there. But you can't just transliterate the word as deacon, right? So we see diakonon. It might just be understood. This is how I understand the passage is a servant. So she's a servant of the church. So I think that's the challenge. Now I did want to mention on Calvin here. Some people like to cite Calvin as affirming deaconesses, but his view is a little different because, as Thomas said, Calvin understood the widows of 1 Timothy 5 to be deaconesses, and so that they had to be over 60, right? They had to enroll in the church. So that's his take on 1 Timothy 5. That's not the only view on that passage, but that's how Calvin understood it. And then he actually had, two. He made a distinction. Let's at least say that he had the men who were deacons, who they were the administrators, they led in a sense, and then you had these widows who were servants, but they weren't holding the same position. And so, people really should be careful about appealing to Calvin for if they're in favor of ordaining deaconesses or something like that, because that's Calvin is more complicated than usually what they're advocating. And usually they're not wanting to limit it to women over 60. So, there's problems there. And of course you have Warfield and some later Reformed theologians who were, argued for deaconesses in some sense. But I would say most of the Reformed have not gone down that path.
And Professor Dunson, whether this word diakonon is masculine or feminine is kind of complicated. Would you explain that probably better than I can?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously this is referring to Phoebe. The specific form of the word. I mean, there's not a uniquely feminine form of the word
Right.
that's used here. But there's no doubt that it's describing her as a servant. Something I was thinking about today, just thinking about this topic, is this word diakonos is used throughout the New Testament. I mean, all over the place. One example I think that will make something clear is Jesus, when he says in Matthew 20:26, he says, "Whoever would be great among you must be your diakonos, must be your servant." And he has every Christian in mind there.
Mm.
That's seeking greatness in the kingdom of God by serving your brothers and sisters in Christ, being a diakonos. I don't know anyone who suggests that we should have an office that applies to every single Christian, right? Every single Christian is in the office of deacon or deaconess simply because that word, Jesus uses that word diakonos, the exact same word that Paul is using here of Phoebe. So there's a certain sense in which every Christian is called to be a servant.
Sure.
That's actually really important, and you see both men and women actively engaged in service in the church all throughout the book of Acts, all throughout Romans 16, and all these things. But that doesn't actually prove that the more restricted sense of office in 1 Timothy 3 is open to women, or that there's a separate office for women.
I see. Yes, and that makes sense. I mean, there's the general office of all believer, but if everyone has something, then that doesn't make it in any way distinct or helpful as a distinguishing category. These are the
Yeah,
categories. Everything. That's not
exactly.
really a
Yeah.
category, then, is it?
I heard recently someone made the argument that since the BCO, even the changed BCO, doesn't say that you cannot have deaconesses, that you have Christian freedom to have deaconesses, and I know that's something we're going to talk about. And I heard a really good response to that, which was, I mean, it was actually asking a question. What then? And this also gets into the idea that we have people that can assist the deacons, and that could be both men and women that the session appoints, and so on. So if we're going to have women that are assisting the deacons, and we're going to call them deaconesses, what do we call the men who aren't deacons who are going to assist the deacons? Right? You got a problem there. You can't call them deacons, like that's explicitly prohibited, but you can't come up with a similar corresponding name for them or title for them that you've given to the women, deaconess. When you frame it in those terms, you realize something's wrong there, right? You're trying to create this office for the females who are assisting the deacons, and you can't do that for the men. So I just thought that was a really good response to that. I mean, not to mention just the issue of like, you have Christian freedom. Why would you want to take the one word that is just the female version of deacon and apply that to women when they can't serve in that office anyway? But
yeah, that's a fair question, and I don't have a problem personally with the title deaconess, but I don't have an answer for you either. What would you call a male assistant to the deacon? Because calling him assistant to the deacon sounds like Dwight Schrute rather than an ecclesiastical title. So you're not accusing anyone of being heterodox by the use of the title deaconess. But how Thomas, how have you approached this issue without or trying not to disturb the peace of the church? As you acknowledge in your article, peace and unity don't require the absence of division or difference of opinion.
Yeah, so I think lots of times, we don't do this very well as a church, specifically when we have disagreements. But I think we need to have good discourse as brothers, and as we seek to be able to not only just, encourage one another, but also where we can find unity. Because if we truly disagree, then there's a chance for us to be able to hone our arguments and sharpen our thought, but also get challenged and convicted to be able to change our practices. And so we need to be better at that. And Twitter is not, or X is not the best avenue for this. You're always limited in your characters. And so we need to start to articulate our thoughts well, I think, and ask probing questions. And so that's what I sought to be able to do with this article, looking at the PCA and looking at this practice. I think that the best form of this practice is the non-ordained commissioned deaconesses is kind of the best practice that I see. And so that takes on various approaches throughout our denomination. And I believe it's unhealthy and unhelpful. And so, I want to be able to challenge brothers and say, here's things to be able to consider, and to be able to, point them to what I think is a helpful section in our BCO of 9-7 to be able to say, I think this is what we should be doing and following. And if at least they're thinking about it and pondering about it, I think that's kind of a win for me. I think that there's practices when we talk about this non-ordained commissioned deaconesses that is unhelpful, and it can either diminish the deacons. It can it's unhelpful for people in the pews, to be able to understand what that means. And so that's really what I sought to be able to do with this article, is trying to approach it more not like I'm right, you're wrong, but as a brother, I see these concerns that I think are very important, that I think we need to be able to discuss and work out, and we need to be able to handle this as a PCA. And we can change the BC all we want, but if we're going to read it in a certain way, then it's unhelpful to the church. So, that's why I kind of went about it this approach, instead of trying to go do judicial or overtures. I think, let's talk about it. Let's try and work out some of these kinks, and maybe we do find some common ground where we find the agreement, but we do it in a certain light and are open and transparent about that. So that's kind of my approach to why I went about it this way.
Yeah, and that's helpful and important, that you're trying to win your brothers. I know that language comes from Matthew 18, but you're not accusing anybody of sin. You're just, I'd love for you to come and see things from my perspective. But what is the basis of our unity in the PCA? It's not that we sincerely believe something, or that we're sincere in what we do and practice. What determines the boundaries of the PCA and the confines of what it is to be PCA? Zach, you want to help us think through that?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's that we subscribe to a common confession, Westminster Standards, and we have a constitution that also includes the Book of Church Order. So, I think that really gets to the heart of this issue, is how are we approaching our constitution? And, even if brothers disagree on how we should approach women in their relation to the diaconate, I think the BCO, our Book of Church Order, is rather clear on 2 points. We have ordained deacons that is limited to men, and we also have the allowance for assistants to the deacons. Those can be male or female. And so I think the question here is, what is a proper approach to the constitution of the PCA? how are we to read and implement the Book of Church Order? And I have concerns as to those commissioning deaconesses, as to what exactly their relation to the BCO is, in that they have no positive law for it. So the BCO does not state that you are allowed to commission deaconesses. So you're not granted that authority as a church. So, and Professor Dunson was getting at this earlier, is the approach seems to be, well, I'm going to do it because the BCO doesn't forbid it. But if we actually read the BCO that way, right? If that's our approach, there's a lot of things that the BCO does not forbid or explicitly forbid, and it just doesn't touch on everything. It's not a comprehensive document. I mean, it's trying to touch on the most important matters. So I think so. There's a couple problems here. Is one, the language of deaconess, which is not found in the BCO. So I think that alone is a good reason not to use it. But second is the language and practice of commissioning in the BCO is tied with already ordained officers, and it carries authority. And so, and I argue, hopefully a forthcoming article also mentioning in Scripture how language of commission is used, which is limited, but there is some scriptural background. So, I mean, I think we seem to all agree that this language of commissioning deaconesses is confusing and breeds confusion in the church. And so that's a problem for the peace and purity of the church. But what really is the central problem is how are we approaching our Constitution of the Book of Church Order? And I think a good faith approach would say, well, if the BCO doesn't allow our church to do that, on whatever matter it is, I mean, we can
positively, extend, not just is silent, but positively allow. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. I mean, we shouldn't be doing things that the BCO doesn't permit, and particularly when it does touch on a matter. And so in this case, obviously, we can just walk through this. The BCO does touch on deacons, the office of deacon, and it does touch on assistants to the deacons. And so I would say a good faith approach to the Book of Church Order and trying to read it closely and follow it closely is we ordain men as deacons, and that would involve laying on of hands and prayer and a charge and all these things, that as part of an ordination service or installation. Or we depending on the situation, we can appoint male and female, or just female. You can do it however you want. Assistants to the deacons. So then we have to ask the question: what exactly are people trying to do when they're commissioning deaconesses? Yeah. It seems to be a category that's, well, it's not seems. It's not a category in the BCO, and so I just wonder what our churches, what's their approach to the Constitution when they're doing this kind of thing.
Yeah, and Thomas, in your article, you say all churches in the PCA conform their official practice to the position that the office of deacon is distinct from the role of deaconess. But if now many churches, we heard on the floor of General Assembly last year that some churches have withheld ordination from their deacons. Would you agree that there's a distinction between an unordained person called a deacon and an unordained person called a deaconess?
Yeah, so I think if I was to clarify that sentence, after looking at it vigorously, I think I'd probably, PCA churches are seeking to be able to make that distinction. And so what they try and do is try and follow the BCO and say that a deacon, an ordained deacon, is different from a non-ordained commissioned deaconess. And they try and make a distinction there. And they try, I think, trying to see the light in their argument is to be able to say that we're trying to follow the BCO. I think where it gets convoluted and difficult is that this practice varies drastically from church to church. It's not, once you start going outside the bounds of what the BCO states and you start reading in the white lines and creating certain things and working out certain processes to be able to get to that point, you start, the practice can vary. So I'm sure there's churches that elect non-ordained commissioned deaconesses in a similar fashion that they would elect officers to the office of deacon. And, so the practice varies. And so I think that makes it quite difficult again, where I think this discussion hopefully is helpful, where people start to be able to think about the errors and problems which arise from when we come, what Zach was saying before, what I call the normative principle of polity. Instead of reading the BCO and what it describes and prescribes, we start to just assume that we do what we want, or in light of what it doesn't say. And if we're starting to read the BCO in that light, then the BCO doesn't say a lot.
It wouldn't mean a lot.
Yeah, well, and if we were to start to write what the BCO doesn't say, what we shouldn't do, that would be a long BCO, and it would be hard to amend and update. And so instead of listing what it doesn't say, even if we were to change in 7-3, where that recent change where it's the office of minister or pastor or elder or deacon, they shouldn't be given to unordained people. But then we are to start to list out all these potential titles that could be used. That would be an extremely large portion of our BCO. But then also we would
you would force
be
me
acknowledging
to stop calling the women at the church the Duchesses of Lancaster. I mean, if you did that, or
so I mean, it would just be a very long list, but also that you would just be unable to be able to curb it. But also, you're then acknowledging that there is a potential. There could be a potential to have this office of deaconess, and that's just not how we kind of in our BCO and in the PCA understand Scripture. So,
right.
What are the bounds of what the PCA is? There's 4 ordination vows that every teaching elder takes. The first one is Scripture. Scripture is the bounds. But it's not just Scripture however we want to be able to interpret it. It's in light of the confession. And then in light of the confession, we also have, our BCO, which then limits it. But then also ordination 4 is submission to the brethren. And I think often how we take that vow is we think that submission to the brethren is discipline reaction, that we submit to them when they discipline. But I think there's an aspect we're submitting to our brethren even underneath the Constitution, where the brethren have voted on this together as a body of body as a court, and we're submitting to them to be able to say we're submitting to what we've agreed on in the PCA. And so I think they're the bounds, and to be able to, have that list of it's not forbidden. That is just a difficult way to be able to read the BCO. But it's also saying then that the BCO doesn't speak of anything of diaconate, doesn't speak of anything of commissioning, doesn't speak of anything of how the diaconate is to function, or if there's no deacons available, who does that authority get passed on to? It's not to unordained officers. That kind of a silly way to phrase it, but it's handed to ruling elders.
Right.
If the church doesn't have deacons or is unable for any reason to be able to secure any deacons, it falls to the ruling elders to be able to carry out those duties, not just to anyone.
And you make a good point that there are no unordained deacons in the PCA. We've made that explicit in our BCO this past year, that if you're not ordained, you're not a deacon. You might be something else. You might be the Duke of Lancaster, but you are not a deacon. That the role, the duties of the diaconate, if there is none, don't go to these unordained people or a deacon team that's not ordained. It goes to the ruling elders. So in your article, Thomas, you make this great point. Ordained deacons. Hey, why don't you read it since you wrote it? If I copy
ordained deacons are not merely volunteers fulfilling the acts of service. They are set apart for a specific office, accountable to the church for their duties. The BCO affirms that deacons are a blessing to the church, not only because of the work they perform, but also because of their practical mercy and organizational structure they provide.
So what's lost without an ordained diaconate? If I'm planning a church and I just want to have a deacon team and not ordain anybody, which I guess, and I wrestled with that because, if you call it the deacon team, that implies that everyone on that team is a deacon. But then I thought, well, no, because everybody on a baseball team is not a baseball. So you could have a deacon team, I guess, and at least it would make sense in the English language. But for our Constitution, what's lost if we don't have ordained deacons?
Well, I think that kind of, to my point, this is where it starts to really unravel.
Okay.
It becomes more than just a semantic term and phrase of what you're doing.
Yeah.
But our BCO begins with Jesus Christ as the head of the church. And a part of his head of the church, he gave officers, he gave oracles and ordinances. And so we believe that as offices of the church, that we have two, elder and then deacon. And those are gifts from Christ to his church. It's not merely just a practical solution to a problem. As we see in Acts 6, the seed form of the diaconate is that here the apostles didn't say mercy ministry should not be a part of the church. This isn't the commission that we were given by Christ to be able to make disciples, by baptizing and teaching. That they saw it was a vital part of the church, and so they thought it was so vital that they established the seed form of the diaconate. And we see that established in churches, that they're a blessing to the church. Not only the office, but the officers Christ blesses his church with. And so to me, it starts to be able to say, if you start to be able to diminish the diaconate and say, we don't need those chapter 9 in the BCO, we can work around it. That I think is losing something vital to the church. And the diaconate is not merely just a practical function, a hospitality team. They take on some spiritual ability to be able to help counsel and help those in the church that are suffering, that need mercy. And, if there's deacons that are meeting with people, just helping them, but not praying with them, I don't think we truly understand that function of what a deacon should do. And so I think it's very important that the deacons, that we have that chapter in our BCO for a reason, specific functions. And, often I don't think churches utilize what it's called to be able to do. Often it's about budgets and buildings. That's what the deacons look after, but that's not the scriptural mandate given to them specifically. They've got a much greater call. And that's why it's important that they have the calling, the qualifications, and also the ordination of that position. Calvin, again, he in the Institutes, he actually rebukes the Catholic Church for dismantling the diaconate for what it was intended to be. Now, they're not, Romanists trying to establish what the Catholic Church had in the PCA, but I do think that what he was saying is that, Christ has ordained this office, and it's there for a specific function, and the church should seek to be able to follow that function that Christ has given to his church. And so for me, it starts to unravel, not merely in the terms that we use, but how we approach what it is. It's not an optional office. There can be a church like Titus in Crete, that Crete is not ready to ordain deacons, but that should be the strange, peculiar church in our polity. It should be established that this is the goal. We want a diaconate to be able to help the ruling elders and the teaching elders in the church, so they can focus on word and prayer. So I think if we merely just see it as a practical function of a ministry team, then sure, what use is it? But it's more than that. It's Christ has given us the offices of elder and deacon, and that's very important.
Ryan, if I could add to that,
Yeah.
I think one important feature here of the diaconate is that they are leaders in the church, and they do exercise a form of authority. And I realize not everyone agrees with that, but I'm going to explain. So the church is appointing deacons right? They're a sort of representative like the elders, though they're for spiritual purposes. It's a spiritual office of service. But if you look at like 1 Timothy 3, it says that this is 1 Timothy 3:12. Deacons must be husbands of only one wife and good managers of their children in their own households. And he doesn't elaborate on it there, but the reason that matters is if you can manage your household well, that demonstrates that you can serve or exercise some authority in the church. And the reasoning is more clear there earlier when applied to elders, because it has the same language for elders. He must be one who manages his own household well, keeping his children under control with all dignity. And then Paul asked the question in verse 5, but if a man does not know how to manage his own household, how will he take care of the church of God? So I think likewise, deacons need to be able to manage their household well, because they will be managing in some sense the affairs of the church as far as service. So I do think there's an authority aspect there. The church is appointing some men to serve the church. They serve on a deacon board. They do vote on matters. And so there is a leadership aspect. I'll also note, according to our BCO, deacons subscribe to the confession. So there's a higher standard here, both morally, but also theologically for them. They need to be, just like elders, affirming the, full Westminster doctrine. And
approving the form of government as consistent with the principles of biblical polity, which I think is relevant to your point. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's a great point. Yeah, so they have to be, Presbyterian. So they're submitting to the standards and to our Constitution in its entirety. The last thing I want to mention is we do take vows. Well, deacons take vows to their office, but the members, the church, also takes vows to the deacons to obey them. That's in the BCO, and so it's like elders. So they do. This is why I know some people don't want to use the language of authority. They want to use that
sympathy and service alone.
Yeah, I'm saying it's both.
Yeah,
and I think that's clear, even the fact that we're taking vows to obey the deacons.
As you point out here, Thomas, in your article, that there seems to be a loophole that really isn't, a constitutional document isn't a place to be looking for loopholes. We frown on lawyers who do that in the secular sphere, contract loophole and so on. Professor Dunson, you've suggested elsewhere at other times that if you can't have an unordained person as a deacon, you may not have an unordained person as a deaconess because it's the same Greek word. Can you flesh out that argument?
Well, there's no special word for two separate categories. It's the same word that's applied to men and women in the New Testament when it's used in the generic sense of just someone who's a servant of some sort.
Yeah.
And there's not two offices. Now, 1 Timothy 3, feminist biblical scholarship will argue that there are two offices there, that Paul is making a distinction in verse 8, that's the male deacons, and then in verse 11, when he says likewise women, that he's referring to female deacons there.
And so not deaconesses, but similar to the way they have it in the ARP, where you have an ordained woman deacon.
Right. So I think there are probably people in the PCA who have made that argument, but that's not the normal way that deaconesses are argued for in the PCA, because they want to say we're not advocating for an equivalent female version of the office, the authoritative office of deacon. And so that way of arguing wouldn't be open to someone who's trying to argue. In fact, almost the only argument I ever hear is just Christian freedom. The BCO doesn't say we can't, so we can, rather than making a biblical argument, right? Because you'd have the same problem with Phoebe in Romans 16:1. Feminist biblical scholarship is going to say, look, it's a female deacon, it's the office. But that's not an argument that an office holder in the PCA can make, because then what they're actually arguing is that women should be introduced into the office of deacon, and they can't make that. That's explicitly prohibited, and so they don't make that argument. So neither of those ways of arguing are open to anyone in the PCA as an office holder. And no one does this. It's interesting. No one does this with pastors. So no one says, okay, we've got pastors. We need to have pastrixes. We need to have a female non-ordained pastrix sort of thing. And then
except for shepherdesses, some churches have shepherdesses.
Well, yeah, I guess that's true. Yes, so I shouldn't say never. I should never say never. Yeah. Well, I guess that just blows that out of the water. But they shouldn't do that. And then you start using weird things where the elders appoint the assistants to the deacons. There's no service. There's no laying on of hands. There's no ordination. There's no calling from the congregation or anything of the sort. But you sort of have a pseudo version of that for something that isn't an office and can't be an office. And so that's kind of an issue. I actually think I've been guilty of this myself. Even the so-called title diaconal assistant, right? In the BCO, it's not a title. It just says the elders may appoint assistants. And that is not. They may appoint people to assist. Actually, is the language. They may appoint people to assist. That's not an office. That's not a title. That is just. To put it in simple terms, that's just the session asking men and women in the church to help the deacons in their work, right? So there's to even suggest that would require a commissioning or any sort of pseudo ordination, right? That's not what the BCO says. It says they're appointed by the session. And so we do all these things where we are like, well, okay, so they're not officers, they're not deacons, but we're going to do everything we can to make it seem like they are. We're going to give them the same title, the same name, except use the female form. And we're going to use pseudo ordination kind of language and practice and all of that. So, I mean, that's kind of a long-winded answer to your question about the word itself.
Yeah, but that's really helpful for me that, people, the word, and Thomas, you bring this out in your article, that the word deaconess is just the feminized version of deacon, which, we do in English with waitress, stewardess, and so on. But there is no feminized form of the word deacon in the Greek, which is noteworthy. That deaconess is, you don't get that from the Greek, is what I hear you saying, Professor Dunson.
Right. I mean, it's feminine if it's a woman, right? It's feminine if it's attached to a woman. It's masculine if it's attached to a man, but the word's the same.
Right. So there's no feminine. It's just
you can have the article. You can have the feminine article or the masculine article if you have the article, but it's still the same word. Yeah. There's not a distinguishing between two things.
Wasn't there a Greek word later developed that is the feminine? But I think it was like post New Testament, if I remember correctly.
Oh yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah.
But it's not. The fact is, it's not used in the New Testament.
Yeah.
Which is, the final authority and can't be amended like the rest of our Constitution.
One of the things that I think is interesting to point out here is that, when you're trying to think of your limits of your brain, it becomes, endless. But I cannot think, normally when we use terminology in the church, most of the times when we refer back to a office, we actually retain the Greek or the Latin. And so, we're associating that with the biblical principle of the deacon or the presbyter. They're kind of the same word. And so now we're using this title that is deaconess, but really we don't take that terminology when we apply it to any other aspect of the church that I can be aware of. That so in inference, we're somewhat referring back to. We're not calling it office, but we're applying the same model that we use when we call an office by a Greek term. Most people wouldn't understand Greek if they saw it, but if you transliterated diakonon, I think they'd be able to work it out, or presbyteros or whatever, they'd be able to work it out. And so I think it's just a strange thing that we apply this model of deaconess to this non-ordained commissioned office or quasi-office, whatever you want to call it. But it's, there's many, like I said, that sweater that unravels that kind of, to me, raises caution in how we use terminology.
Yeah. So there's no explicit prohibition, but you argue that it's just problematic, Thomas. Would you go through some of those reasons that you list in your article? That the implication, the confusion that is created with this title, and then when we commission them, as Professor Dunson and teaching elder Garris have noted, that creates a lot of confusion if they're commissioned.
Yeah, so I in my article I kind of point out 7 arguments why I think we should stop using that terminology of non-ordained commissioned deaconesses. I do think it's unhelpful. The first one is kind of that it's based on that semantic range. If we've got people in the pew, you can be a student of Calvin and of church history and understand. Okay, so a deaconess has never held a position of an ordained office, so therefore that's a different phrase. But generally speaking, most people in the pews, particularly if we're trying to evangelize and reach out to the lost or the skeptic, wouldn't understand those differences. And so when they hear the word deaconess, they're hearing the difference between waiter and waitress. They're not making that distinction that needs to be clear. So that the semantic range. The next is dealing with the confusion. And so I think the first one brings confusion with the title, but even, commissioning, often I think that looks very similar to the process of election of the office. There's some form of vote, in my understanding, that happens. There's some form of service that reflects similar to an ordination service, and probably even hand in hand. And then we try and make distinctions about, what's the difference between commissioning and ordination. And we try and, we didn't lay on hands. Well, what happens if you did? Is that then ordination?
Or what happens if they kneel? And is it just the magic word that you don't use the word ordination? Is that what makes it ordination? The presence of one word?
And then also people in the pew. We can argue all we want, but do people in the pew understand that? Or what happens if you're not there and you don't know that they only were commissioned and not ordained? And so I think that creates confusion. The next is diminishing the work of the diaconate. And I think that to me is one of the biggest issues here, is that some churches just stop ordaining deacons. And so I think that's a huge issue, in my opinion, that it just creates an issue. What happens if you're commissioned an authority? Part of ordination, I don't only think that it's the process of selecting someone and setting them apart, but it also raises the bar of what their qualifications are. And the Book of Discipline actually handles ordained office different from a regular church member. They've taken higher vows, and then also, that process is a lot different for an ordained officer in the PCA. And so how do you decommission someone, to use that kind of phrase, that the BCO just doesn't give us a category for that. And so it creates all these issues. The next is the normative principle of polity, where I think it's dangerous to be able to read the BCO in light of what it doesn't say. That to me is very problematic, and we would just end up with so many different denominations. Specifically, when the BCO does speak of the diaconate, it does speak about what happens when you don't have enough deacons. It does speak about how people are to be able to help and assist the diaconate. And then the kind of last ones are kind of SJC case that I look at in the Women in the Church study committee report. But
Yeah, that,
you know,
that SJC case was interesting. You know, that you said if it dealt with the word minister being applied to a woman, but if you changed it to deaconess, the same logic would be argued, would hold for the caution.
Yeah, so I think in the SJC case, the presbytery actually prevailed, and they deferred to the presbytery in that matter. But I think my point is that here the SJC is saying that it's unwise, inequitable, and not for the profit and welfare of the church. The SJC has its limitations. It's got 4 limitations that they look at any record of the case. They can't limit. You know, they can only limit what is brought up from the lower court. They can't expand that any further. They can't. They're limited in how they can the facts that are presented. Unless there's clear violation and error, then they're limited by those facts. They're limited also by the deferring to the lower court based on who they call as witnesses and things like that. The 4th limitation is more of a limitation constitutionally, that they're limited to the Constitution. And so, you know, I actually think the dissenting opinion to that SJC case is very, very good. The SJC case is only a couple of pages long, and I don't think they unpack it well. But the dissenting opinion, I think, raises a lot of concerns with that specific case. But, you know, even if you win those 2 arguments of the SJC and the Women in the Church, people can just say, well, they're not in our Constitution. They're not binding.
Okay. Well, there seems to be a reluctance to modify our Constitution to recognize either diaconesses or to ordain women as deacons. Zach, in your article forthcoming, you point out that in 2009, Tim Keller and Ligon Duncan were having a discussion, and the late Tim Keller noted that if he were in the EPC, he would have women ordained as deacons. And not that long ago, was it 2021? There was an overture from Metro New York Presbytery that was sent up to modify the women on the diaconate, but then withdrawn. So do you think there's a reluctance? Why are we having so much discussion about whether we ordain women to the office of deacon or whether we have deaconesses? Why not just send up an overture?
So to clarify with Keller's statement, he didn't use the word ordained, but he did say he would have. But he did say he would have women deacons if he were in the EPC. He said probably, and he said Dr. Duncan probably would not, which is, I think, correct.
Yeah.
So
and it's hypothetical anyway. So
yeah, it's hypothetical, but he was answering a question, and so I think it gets to part of the problem is Tim Keller was saying that he wanted or would have, if he could, ordained deacons, like women deacons, and not even necessarily using the word deaconess. I don't know.
Yeah.
So look, I don't know the motives of everyone who's practicing commissioning deaconesses, but Tim Keller was at least stating publicly that he would, if he could, he would have the ordination of them. At least, I don't know. The year before, he said something different, so it's hard to tell. But
yeah,
regardless, if people were to try to change the PCA's BCO on this matter to ordain women as deacons, that would not pass. I think that's pretty clear, which is why there have not been efforts to do it. But then that raises the problem. Well, if that won't pass, it's not a popular opinion or desire to change. Our BCO is clear. Then you should just have male deacons, and then women can be appointed to assist them and the like. So I think the reason probably people aren't pushing it is it's not only would it not pass, but a lot of these churches are able to get away with this kind of third category of commissioned deaconesses. And so why rock the boat? Just keep doing what you're doing if that's what you want. But I think it sounds like what we're all saying is the problem with this is it seems to be skirting our rules. And that's my concern, is rather than submitting to the brethren, submitting to the church on this matter, And you can try to change opinion, but you can't you can't openly violate the Constitution. And so I think the concern is people are not taking that attitude, not everyone in the PCA, and they're just commissioning deaconesses because it's not prohibited. Nothing's really stopped it to this point. And so churches continue to do it. And I just think that's a dangerous precedent. I'm sure we could think of other matters that the BCO does not explicitly forbid that you could start doing, and maybe no one would, press charges. I mean, but why do we always have to press charges for everything? Why can't we approach our Constitution in good faith and in submission to the brethren? I think that's really what we're getting at, trying to get at the heart of the matter, which I think is having an honest denomination, a rule-following denomination, a good faith denomination.
Well, Professor Dunson, you teach at a seminary, so you deal with students in a lot of different denominations. What options are available to guys in the PCA who are dissatisfied with the constitutional standard on women, on deacons, and the diaconate?
Well, yeah, you can try to change it. Pastor Garris said you can try to change it without acting against it in the meantime. And if you're not willing to try to change it, then there are denominations that still adhere to the Westminster Confession who do allow it. So you could go there, the EPC being one of them. It's hard not to at this point. It's hard not to say something that's going to make it seem seem as if you're questioning the motives of some people, because there are people, I think, in the PCA that want actual ordination of female deacons, but like Pastor Garris said, they know that that's not going to happen right now, and so it's kind of like this is second best. And to my mind, if that's actually the case, then that's not someone who's in good faith subscribing to our Constitution. They're kind of doing it under duress because they don't have a choice. And I want to ask those people, and I have asked them, and why? Like, why insist on this? Why insist on this? What is so important about using the female form of an office title for women who can't be in that office? What's so important about that? Why insist on that? And I've never really received an answer other than I have the freedom to do it. I'm not prohibited from doing it. And that makes me think that there has to be something else that's really driving that. And the something else, I think, is just not being content with that. Like you said, I don't think someone who believes in female deacons is a gospel denying heretic, but it's still important.
Yeah. Well, Thomas, Ben, Zach, thank you so much for your time and talking about these issues. Thomas, thank you for that article. Zach, I look forward to reading your forthcoming article. Ben, you'll probably write something soon, right?
Oh yeah, I haven't written on deacons recently, but
yeah, you're prolific in your work at the American Reformer. We're very grateful for that as well. So, thank you all.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining the conversation on the Westminster Standard, which is the podcast of Jude 3. For more information or to support our work at promoting confessional renewal within the Presbyterian Church in America, please visit our website, jude3pca.org. Join us again next time. I'll talk to you then.